Why would a mother have to give a sacrifice after giving birth to a child? Does the Old Testament law put childbirth and sexuality as dirty and condemned aspects of life? Does this make women inferior to men because of these laws? Hello and welcome back. My name is Matt with Disciple Truth, and today we will be covering Leviticus 12 and 15. This is somewhat out of the order of Leviticus with the chapter numbers here, but the subject matter of both of these chapters have great overlap because they cover childbirth and procreation, respectively. As a direct result of the subject matter, the following material will be thoughtful and medically accurate as possible. However, viewer discretion is advised. With that warning aside, we will first cover the content of Leviticus 12 and 15. Chapter 12 primarily deals with purification after childbirth, and Leviticus 15 primarily deals with discharges from the body, both diseased and normal and body function. Beginning in Leviticus 12, we have the following structure of this shorter chapter. In verse 1, God speaks to Moses, who is then supposed to instruct the Israelites about the following commands, which carry divine weight because they come from God. Verse 2 describes that if a woman bears a son, she would be unclean for 7 days, as she would be in menstruation. Now, the rules for uncleanliness during menstruation are more described in Leviticus 15, which we'll get to here in a moment. But essentially, a woman would make many items unclean that she either touched, sat down on, or lied down on as she was undergoing her cycle. On the 8th day, the male would have to be circumcised, which dates back to the Abrahamic covenant given in these passages. Following the initial 7 days, the mother would continue in the process of purification for an additional 33 days. During her time of purification, she isn't to touch anything holy or go into God's sanctuary or touch anything in God's sanctuary. This time of purification was still probably classified as uncleanliness, but probably was not as defiling as the first 7 days, since there was a distinction to be made. This would possibly mean that the mother wouldn't defile objects that she touches or sits down on or lies down on in those 33 days. People that she would interact with or touch would probably not be defiled as well, and she would likely be able to resume intercourse with her husband at this time, which would be banned in menses. In total, the 40 days would pass from birth to the last day of purification if she had given birth to a son. Now, the purification process would be lengthened if a woman gave birth to a girl. A mother would be unclean as in menses for the first 2 weeks or 14 days after giving birth to a baby girl. And the days of purification following that 2-week period would be 66 days, which would total 80 days until purification was complete. Following the purification process, God prescribes that the mother must offer a burnt offering and a sin offering to be fully cleansed from her flow of blood. She is to offer a lamb, a year-old male, for a burnt offering, and or a pigeon turtle dove for a sin offering. This was to be done after her initial cleansing, whether she had a boy or girl, or after that 40 to 80 day period. The priest would take these animals and make atonement for her, and then she would become clean and be able to interact with the tabernacle. This is important to note that these offerings were given for the mother, not for the child. In verse 8, God makes a provision for those who can't afford a lamb for a burnt offering, but they were to offer 2 pigeons or turtle doves, one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering. Once the priest burnt these animals with their appropriate offerings, then the woman would become clean. Moving from Leviticus 12, we will move to Leviticus 15. This chapter discusses discharges, both diseased and healthy, that men and women can both have. It discusses how one can become clean again after these discharges. The following structure of Leviticus 15 is shown here in this particular slide. God speaks again to Moses and Aaron to teach the Israelites the following commandments. As it was stated throughout Leviticus, when these laws are given, they carry divine weight. The first part of chapter 15 deals with men that have some kind of discharge from their body. This discharge likely refers to something that is not normal and is likely to be diseased based on the descriptions that are given. Leviticus 15:3 reads, "And this is the law of his uncleanliness for a discharge, whether his body runs with a discharge or his body is blocked up by a discharge, it is his uncleanliness." Leviticus 15 also doesn't necessarily mention where the discharge is coming from either. It is possible that it can refer to any part of the body. However, given the organization and the subject matter of the whole chapter, it's likely an emphasis on gynecological diseases. Every bed that this unclean man lies down on and everything that he sits on will be unclean. This includes saddles or anything else that would otherwise touch him or be under him. Also, if he was to touch an earthenware vessel or something made of clay, that item would be discarded and destroyed. And if the article that he touched was made out of wood, then it had to be rinsed with water. There were also rules for those who interacted with the unclean men. Other people would have to wash their clothes and bathe and be unclean until evening if they did any of the following. If they touched the bed of the unclean man or anything that the unclean man laid down on. They would also have to wash if somebody sat on the same seat as the unclean man did. Also, if they were touched by the unclean man, then the individual that was touched had to wash. If an unclean man spit on anyone, then that person would have to undergo cleansing as well. If someone touched anything that was under him or carried any of the items that were under him, like a saddle, then they would have to wash and be unclean until evening. If they touched anything, if they were touched by the unclean man without having the unclean man wash his hands prior to that, then they would also become unclean. If the unclean man also became clean and was healed of his discharge, the affected person should count 7 days from his cleansing. After those 7 days, he shall bathe his body with fresh water and be clean. On the 8th day, that unclean man who had that kind of gynecological disease shall bring 2 turtle doves and shall give it to the priest to offer as a sacrifice for a sin offering and a burnt offering to make atonement for his discharge. This also bears resemblance to the mother that would have been cleansed from her flow of blood in Leviticus 12, as well as the leper that was cleansed of his disease in Leviticus 14, which we'll cover in the next video. Following this section of disease discharges for men, we have the healthy discharges of a man, which essentially covers nocturnal emissions, ejaculation, and copulation. In all instances, the man becomes unclean and has to wash with water and be unclean until evening. And if he was with a woman, she would have to do the same. Anything that was contaminated by bodily fluids is also unclean and will need to be washed with water and be unclean until evening. After that, the next section that is covered within Leviticus 15 pertains to the healthy discharges of a woman, which primarily covers when a woman's on her cycle. The woman who starts on her period will be unclean for a total of 7 days if things were occurring normally. Similarly to the man that had a unclean discharge, whomever she touches will be unclean until evening, and everything that she lies on will be also unclean. Everything that she sits on will be unclean, and if someone was to touch what the menstruant lay or sat on, they would also have to wash their clothes and bodies and be unclean until evening. There is no mention of her touching a person and needing to wash, but that might have been implied in verse 19 of chapter 15 of Leviticus. If a man was to sleep with a woman during her menstruation, he would be unclean for 7 days with all the same requirements that she would have during that time. Moving from the healthy discharges of a woman, we move to the unhealthy discharges of a woman in Leviticus 15. This section primarily deals with a woman that has menorrhagia or a woman that has a prolonged or heavy period. As long as she bleeds or is shedding, she would be unclean. The same rules applies to this disease situation as a normal menstruation would for a woman, in that whatever she lies down on or sits on is unclean. Other people that she touched, or if they touched what she sat down or lied on, would also be unclean until evening, and they would have to wash and bathe. However, if she is healed from her flow, then the woman would have to count 7 days from the time she was healed and wash herself and then be clean. After this, on the 8th day, the person that had this unclean discharge, this woman, would have to get 2 turtle doves or pigeons for a sin offering and a burnt offering, and the priest would offer it on her behalf for atonement for her unclean discharge. Following the main body of information given in Leviticus 15, God gives his rationale for these rules. Thus you shall keep the people of Israel separate from their uncleanliness, lest they die in their uncleanliness by defiling my tabernacle, which is in their midst. Leviticus 15:32 then concludes the chapter by saying this is the law for discharges, menstruation, and emission. There also bears mention on a couple of other passages that touch on this subject as well. Leviticus 18:6 and 20:18 both ban intercourse during menstruation. This prohibition was placed in the laws that prohibited various sexual practices and placed a judgment on this act under being cut off from the people of God, which often means either divine execution or execution carried out by legal authorities. Ezekiel also mentions that sensuality during menstruation is also a sin that Israel committed in Ezekiel 18:6, 22:10, 36:17. This may seem to be a contradiction at first when you read Leviticus 15:24, because it speaks of when a man is with a woman on her period, he would need to become unclean, but isn't condemned to the death penalty. However, it is important to note that uncleanliness was to be shunned in its entirety in Leviticus 15. As I mentioned in the last chapter, the goal of an Israelite for their life was to be clean, and being unclean would not be as desirable. This is duly reinforced in Leviticus 18 and 20. But it should also be noted that Leviticus 15 may be addressing uncleanliness that is contracted when a man and woman come together and she is found to be bleeding at the time of intimacy. So therefore, it might not necessarily be a willful sin, but rather an accident. This would be different, as Leviticus 18 and 20 seem to indicate people that knowingly come together during menstruation is taking place. As a result, there's not really a contradiction here in Scripture, and it's fully complementary, and they address different situations. But now that the content of Scripture has been explored for Leviticus 12 and 15, let's consider the possible interpretation between these two chapters. As was discussed in the last chapter, cleanliness may be a stand-in or emblem for moral purity or righteousness, whereas uncleanliness may be picturesque or symbolic for the sin or the curse of sin. When considering the possible subject matter of Leviticus 12 and 15, these chapters primarily deal with purification of the production and the giving birth to a child. Whenever there is a transmission of fluid, irregular menses, or birth of a child, it was always considered defiling. As a result, the process of producing and giving birth to a child is under the curse of sin. And at the fall, God cursed childbirth specifically, as he spoke to Eve. I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing, and in pain you shall bring forth children. The curse of sin directly affected childbirth, which may have been the reason why uncleanliness is contracted at childbirth. David reflects in the Psalms at how at birth the human race is sinful. Psalm 51, 4-5 reads, "Against you, you only, have I sinned, and done what is evil in your sight, so that you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgment. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me." Psalms 58:3 says, "The wicked are estranged from the womb. They go astray from birth, speaking lies." So pervasive is sin in our lives that it affects everything, both external to man in creation, but also internal to man, even to having the beauty of children. This may have been the reason that a mother had to offer a sin offering and a birth offering for atonement for the curse of sin and for her justification. This doesn't necessarily mean that having a child is sinful or what produces a child is wrong intrinsically. The Bible clearly states that having children and subduing the earth is a God-given command, not a suggestion, a command. Song of Solomon glories over the love between a man and a woman. And the Bible also talks about having children in a positive light as they are a blessing for the Lord. Psalms 127, 3-5 reads, "Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate." Proverbs 17:6 reads, "Children's children are the crown of the aged, and parents are the pride of their children." Not to mention that one of the blessings that God would give the people of Israel, if they followed his covenant, was that the fruit of the womb would also be blessed. It can be clearly seen that children are a blessing from the Lord. But again, the law illustrates what God said in Genesis, and that sin has affected even childbirth, as well as procreation. There is something to be noted here when it comes to the offering of a mother in Leviticus 12. The mother was to offer the sacrifices for herself and not the child. This can be seen in Leviticus 12:7. "And he, the priest, shall offer it, the animals, before the Lord and make atonement for her. Then she shall be clean from the flow of her blood. This is the law for her who bears a child, either male or female." Since the process of giving birth to a child was under the curse of sin, it had to be atoned for by a sin offering, which would be made in faith for those who wish to be redeemed in the final or true sin offering, who is Christ. It wasn't that the child had committed sin that necessitated a sin offering, but it was the mother who had the curse of sin in childbirth. The child, who has not done anything wrong yet, since they literally were just being born, would not need to be justified here. Part of the reason why this is important is because Mary, the mother of Jesus, offered a sacrifice as a dutiful Israeli mother should. If the sin offering was for Jesus, then one could argue that Jesus was also sinful at birth. But since the law is very clear that the atonement was for the mother and not the child, Christ's innocence, as well as his perfection, could also be clearly seen and very easily defended. Moving from Leviticus 12 to 15, we see a similar pattern. Concerning the initial section, we have the disease discharges of a man, and in the later section, or kind of the last quarter, if you will, of the chapter, it covers the disease discharges for the woman. As mentioned in the last chapter, sickness or disease things are reminiscent of decay and is consequent to death, which is the final or end result of sin. The curse of sin finds its culmination in death, which can be clearly seen here as well. Diseased parts of the body, both in the man and in the woman, are unclean and cause uncleanliness. However, once they are healed, they both had to wait 7 days and then to offer a sin and burnt offering, which would be, turtle doves for that on the 8th day. This parallels the mother who had given birth to a child, in that it's not sinful to have a child, and sometimes it's not really the choice of an individual to have a disease or sickness, and it may not be a direct result of someone's sin. However, since sin is the ultimate reason for these things, because the curse of sin was given in Genesis that affects all of creation, the sin offering was necessary to cover and atone for these discharges. The law concerning abnormal discharges is also the backdrop of a story that happened in the New Testament. Jesus healed a woman suffering from menorrhagia, or a prolonged irregular period. The poor woman had spent all that she had on physicians and grew worse. She had this sickness for 12 years, and she would have not been able to come to the temple and worship God due to her uncleanliness. Keep in mind that she also defiled everything that she touched, including people. She lived isolated, alone, and without the ability to approach God's temple. But in faith, this woman sought Jesus and reached out to touch the hem of his garment. That woman was healed of his discharge because of her faith, and Jesus called her daughter. And in this way, we can see that Jesus was the one to cleanse and to heal and to have the greater power over the law. Not only did Jesus cleanse her from her disease, which the law could also not do, but he took her sin on the cross to cleanse her. So we must also call on Jesus to heal us from the curse of sin so that we can also be called daughters and sons of God. Moving into the middle sections of Leviticus 15, we see the normative reproductive bodily functions in a man and in a woman. And in the case of a man, any kind of emission causes uncleanliness. And in the case of a woman, any kind of period would cause uncleanliness. While both of these things are common and healthy bodily functions, they are still under the curse of sin. As a result, they cause uncleanliness, but not to the extent that the disease discharges do, which makes intuitive sense since they're not doubly defiling in that they're normal, they're healthy, but they're still under the curse of sin. The closing of chapter 15 also closes the primary section of cleanliness versus uncleanliness found in Leviticus. The point of Leviticus 11 through 15 was to keep the Israelites away from uncleanliness so it wouldn't defile God's tabernacle. Otherwise, divine judgment would be invoked, and the people that defiled would die in their uncleanliness, as pointed out in Leviticus 15:31. This shows the nature of how serious God was against uncleanliness and the possible interpretation of that uncleanliness being either a sin or the curse of sin. There are other laws that touch on the nature of uncleanliness later on in Leviticus and in the rest of the Pentateuch, but suffice to say that this was the main body of the purity laws given within the entire Pentateuch, and especially with Leviticus. We'll cover leprosy or various skin diseases in the next video. In addition to the general principles as mentioned above, there are several observations to be noted in addition to the possible interpretation above. The first observation is that birth and normal reproductive organ function was not to be a part of worship of the one true God, as opposed to many of the worldviews and religions of that time, and honestly even up to today. Sex and childbirth, while important, beautiful, and gloried over in the Bible, are distinct and are not to be muddied with worship. This in contrast to the many Canaanite and other polytheistic religions where cult prostitutes, sensuality, were centerpieces of belief systems. In contrast, the Israelites were to have proper conduct, especially as they approached God. They would treat God as holy to give him gravitas, especially as they drew near to him. This is clearly seen here in Leviticus 12 and 15. Anyone who had such discharges, whether they be a man or a woman, so it wasn't just women, would be excluded from any of the activities and eventually at the temple. In the New Testament, the worship of God is paramount, and while the means of worship is different from the ancient Israelites today, many of the same core ideas are present. Sensuality and sex, while good and can be enjoyed in their proper context, are not to be used as worship, nor should be the focus of our desires. The chief aim of life is to love and serve God over and above any feeling or desire that we might have. Childbirth is not explicitly discussed in the New Testament, but discipleship of children is very important and a very key and crucial way of following God. A second observation that can be found is that women had several designated times where men did not have the authority over their wives intimately, given by divine directive. This is significant as it can show that men didn't have absolute authority over women, that even they themselves were subject to divine rules as well. This would be in contrast to the surrounding civilized or barbaric nations where might makes right. This is direct opposition to the common assumption that God gave lesser rights to women as opposed to men, as some critics of the Bible also proclaim. A third observation is that many of the laws that are present also have a hygienic or health benefit to them. While the nature of these laws focuses on holiness rather than health, there is undoubtedly some measure of divine oversight for those that are involved. This can be seen primarily in one of two different ways. Firstly, all bodily fluids can be infectious if an individual has an infectious disease. This reality may be part of the reason why, or could have contributed to the reason why, how the Israelites were to be interacting with the unclean individual, as well as anything that the unclean individual touched, in terms of what items or clothing or bedding was soiled. This could also be true of both healthy discharges, whether it be postpartum, regular menses, or in the emissions of a man, as well as the unclean discharges. Even spit is potentially infectious. Clothing and people would have to wash regularly if they interact with compromised materials or unclean people, and sometimes the affected object that the unclean person touched would have to be even disposed of. This would ensure the cleanliness and possibly lack of infectious material being involved with the rest of the people of Israel, which has obvious health benefits to them. When it comes to sensuality during menstruation, this was also prohibited. This may have been done to protect the woman also from increased susceptibility to sexually transmitted diseases, as menstruation involves the sloughing of the endometrial layer of the uterus, giving ample possibility to pathogens to enter into ruptured capillaries. Hence, if intimacy was avoided during this period, all of that could be circumvented. Some studies also note that there may be an association between intimacy during menstruation and increased risk of developing endometriosis. The thought is that during this time, some of the living tissue of the endometrial layer may re-enter into the bloodstream and to be deposited to other places of the body. However, this association that is present here with that is not exactly causative yet in scientific literature, meaning that both the activity of sensuality during menstruation and the condition of endometriosis may be connected or associated together, but that doesn't necessarily mean that one causes the other yet, as it can be seen in this study. It is also at this point that there could be some common objections or objibes that are given to the Bible as a result of these chapters that will be handled sequentially. Objection number 1, why are there different lengths of time for postpartum purification? Within Leviticus 12, a woman who had given birth to a boy had to undergo a process of purification for approximately 40 days, whereas for a baby girl, a woman would have to undergo a process of purification for 80 days. Is it because that women are inferior or are dirtier, and therefore the process had to be longer for baby girls as opposed to baby boys? Is this because men are less defiling and closer to God than women are, for the reason why these lengths of purification are different? Why would this distinction be necessary? There is a possible reasons as to why this might be the case. In Paul Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster?, he writes of several different reasons why this might be the case. The first reason that he primarily covers, as mentioned before, is that for prolonging the purification process for baby girls, is that it made sure that sex and worship would not be intermixed. There is to be a massive distinction between God's people and the people of Canaan. Temple mistresses or temple prostitutes were frequently used as a common way of worship for the Canaanite gods. The dramatization of birth, sensuality, and the like of people and the deities were very much present in Canaan. If a woman had given birth, the mother would have been separated from the tabernacle, and as the case for the baby boy. But if she had been given birth to a baby girl, more care more separation and more safety, if you will, would be given to the baby girl for her. So instead of being inferior, it's quite possible to say that there was more care and protection for a vulnerable baby girl away from any predatory temple practices. Secondly, there may have been a medical reason for this as well. Both the female girl and the mother would have some measure of bleeding due to a drop in estrogen. For the baby girl, this is often called false menses, which usually occurs 2 to 10 days after birth. So in a sense, when a mother had to do twice the amount of purification because there was 2 people shedding blood, but in the case of a baby boy, it would only be the mother. The mother, who would hold the baby, do the diaper changes and the like, may have become unclean since her baby girl might have been bleeding, which would not be unreasonable to see that. In order to account for this kind of occurrence, which is not actually uncommon, a general statement was made for all baby girls instead of baby girls who had this slight bleeding present for those who didn't. This would simplify the normal operating procedure for the Israelites. Leviticus 12:5 states that the cleansing had to happen because of a flow of blood. Hence, combining all the evidence that is present, it's quite possible that God, in his foresight, decided to lengthen the time for a woman to purify herself due to this possible phenomenon. Regardless, though, of the gender of the child, the mother had to still offer a lamb or a turtle dove or 2 turtle dove or pigeons for a burnt offering and a sin offering. And in this sense, there would be equality. There would be no inequality for justification in those things. Menstruation and uncleanliness. Normal bodily function of women includes menstruation, and the Bible declares this to be unclean. The Bible makes out that women to be dirty and as second-class citizens for 7 days, and as a result, one would argue that the Bible would be misogynistic. The answer to the objection is relatively straightforward. First of all, Leviticus 15 primarily deals with both men and women becoming unclean through discharges, so there isn't really a preferential treatment of men versus women in the Bible there. Secondly, men would be unclean for a shorter period of time since their discharge is much shorter than the period of time compared to women's menstruation. This simply could be due to the fact that the women's period lasts for about 1 week. As a result, during that time of discharge, a woman would be unclean as opposed to a man who would just be unclean not nearly so often or as long. Hence, the Bible isn't really biased per se towards men, but rather recognizes women's biology in this particular chapter. In the light of what has been said, the uncleanliness that was contracted in childbirth and various discharges can be seen as an emblem or picture of the curse of sin affecting this aspect of a human's life. Again, it is not that childbirth or that reproductive organ function is intrinsically wrong or bad, but because of sin, the curse of sin has fallen into our bodies. For the Israelites, this means one must become clean when one would want to approach God's tabernacle for worship. This would prove as a reminder for the constant need of God to also purify and cleanse the people from the curse of sin, even to the most wonderful aspects of life, childbirth and sensuality. There is nothing that sin hasn't touched, but God can still cleanse. This changes into the New Testament as the application of being clean and unclean focuses on moral action and sin properly, as it was covered in the last video. However, it should be mentioned that Jesus was greater than sin, as he takes away both sin and uncleanliness. And just as he healed the woman who was unclean with a discharge for 12 years, he can also take away our sin and uncleanliness too, and call us a daughter or son. Moreover, we can also see the humility of Christ, as Bede, who was a Christian that lived between 672 and 673 to 735, pointed out that Jesus not only became a man to save us from our sins, but also came to a poor family to save both the rich and the poor. For Mary, his mother, didn't offer a lamb and a pigeon for her cleansing, but offered only 2 doves, showcasing her poverty. Thanks be to God for Christ's great humility and healing that he brings. May he always take away all of our uncleanness so that we might become daughters and sons of the Most High. Next video that we will be covering will be Leviticus 13 and 14, which discusses human leprosy and disease dwelling places. Thank you so much for watching, and God bless, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.